The high desert does not forgive a mistake, but it reserves a special kind of cruelty for the innocent. In the autumn of 1882, the town of Bitter Creek sat like a jagged tooth in the mouth of the territory. It was a place built on silver and spite, where the wind always carried the taste of alkali and the sound of distant, rhythmic hammering from the mines. Into this stillness rode Clara. She was 20 years old, wearing a calico dress faded by the sun to the color of a bruised sky. She wasn't looking for gold. She was looking for her brother, Thomas, following a letter written in a shaky hand that promised a new start. She stopped at the trough to water her mare, her eyes scanning the storefronts for a familiar face. She didn't find one. Instead, she found the shadow of Marshall Galt. Galt was a man who wore his authority like a borrowed suit, too stiff and unyielding. He watched her from the porch of the jailhouse, his thumbs hooked into a gun belt that had seen more grease than leather. To Galt, Clara wasn't a traveler or a sister, she was a commodity. "Mornin', miss," Galt said, his voice as dry as a thermal vent. "You're a long way from any place that'd have you." "I'm looking for Thomas Thorne," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the way the marshal's deputies began to circle the trough. "He's working the lower veins." The deputies traded a look. It wasn't a look of confusion, it was the look of men who had just seen a bird fly into a snare. "Thomas Thorne is in debt to the syndicate," Galt said, stepping off the porch. "And in Bitter Creek, a debt follows the blood. Vagrancy is a serious charge here. It carries a fine you can't pay, and a sentence you can't outrun." Before the sun had crossed the meridian, Clara's horse was in the town stable. Her brother's letter was crushed into the mud. And Clara herself was behind the iron bars of a basement cell beneath the courthouse. There was no shouting. There was no struggle. There was only the heavy, final sound of a key turning in a lock that hadn't been oiled in a decade. Galt looked through the slats of the cell door, his face a mask of practiced indifference. "The mines need hands for the sorting tables, girl. You'll start at dawn. You'll work until the town decides you're square. Don't bother screaming. The desert has a way of swallowing noise." It was a small crime. A common injustice in a land where the law was often just a mask for greed. But Galt had made one mistake. He had looked at the name on the letter, but he hadn't understood the weight of it. He thought he had taken a girl. He didn't realize he had pulled a thread that would unravel the entire world he had built. The sun dipped behind the rimrock, casting long, bloody shadows across the main street of Bitter Creek. Inside the Silver Shilling saloon, the air was a thick soup of tobacco smoke and the sour sweat of men who spent their days underground. Marshal Galt sat at a corner table, a bottle of rye between him and his two lead deputies. They were celebrating the day's acquisition. To them, Clara was just another ledger entry for the syndicate, another body to feed the machinery of the mines. But at the end of the bar sat Elias, the town's blacksmith. He was a man with arms like gnarled oak and eyes that had seen the frontier turn from a wilderness into a graveyard. He didn't drink with the law. He didn't drink with the miners. He just watched. "You should let her go, Galt," Elias said. The words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that made the piano player's fingers falter for a single beat. Galt didn't turn around. He just grinned into his glass. "You've got a soft heart for a man who beats iron for a living, Elias. The girl is a vagrant. The law is the law." "The law is a suit you stole," Elias replied, finally turning his stool to face the marshal. "I saw the name on that letter she was carrying when you tossed it in the street. Thorne. You think you've locked up a drifter. You haven't. You've locked up a fuse." Galt let out a sharp, jagged laugh. I've heard the campfire stories. Silas Thorne. The ghost of the Brazos. The man who doesn't leave tracks. It's a myth, Elias. A tale told by outlaws to keep their courage up in the dark. I was at the crossing at Blackwater 10 years ago, Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly rasp. I saw what one man did to the regulators. It wasn't a fight. It was a harvest. Silas Thorne isn't a ghost, Galt. He's a man who has run out of things to lose. And that girl is the only thing he has left that still breathes. A silence settled over the saloon. Not the comfortable silence of a finished day, but the brittle silence of a standoff. Even the deputies looked uneasy, their eyes darting toward the darkened windows. He's one man, Galt spat, though his grip tightened on his glass. We've got 20 rifles and a syndicate that owns every mountain in this territory. Let him come. Elias stood up, tossing a single copper coin onto the bar. It rang with a hollow, lonely sound. He won't come with a thundering of hooves, Galt. He won't come with a shout. He'll just arrive. And when he does, you'll find out that silver doesn't stop lead, and a badge doesn't stop a reckoning. Elias walked out, leaving the door swinging on its hinges. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the gaps in the boardwalks like a funeral dirge. Galt tried to take another drink, but the rye tasted like ash. He looked at his deputies, and for the first time, he saw the flicker of doubt in their eyes. They looked at the door, expecting to see a monster. They didn't see anything yet. But the dust was starting to swirl in the street, dancing in circles as if marking the spot where a man was about to die. By the third morning, the air in the cell felt like it had been used too many times. Through the high, dirt-streaked window at the top of the wall, Clara watched the boots of the town pass by. Some were polished leather, some were cracked hide, but they all moved with the same rhythmic indifference. The door to the cell block creaked open, and it wasn't a deputy who entered. It was a man in a charcoal suit, his linen collar white enough to hurt the eyes. This was Mr. Sterling, the architect of Bitter Creek's prosperity. He didn't look at Clara as a person. He looked at her like a farmer looks at a fence that needs mending. It's a pity, Sterling said, his voice smooth and devoid of any jagged edges. A girl of your constitution isn't built for the sorting tables. The dust will settle in your lungs within a month. Your brother, Thomas, he lasted 6. Clara stood up, her fingers gripping the iron bars. Where is he? If he's in debt, I have the silver. I have my mother's ring. Sterling smiled, a thin, bloodless line. Your brother didn't just owe money, Miss Thorne. He owed time. And in this territory, time is the only currency the syndicate accepts. We have a contract with the territorial government. We provide the labor, they provide the vagrancy convictions. It is a very clean, very legal arrangement. The moral scope of the crime finally came into focus for Clara. This wasn't a local marshal's greed. This was a system. A web of corruption that stretched from the dark tunnels of the silver mines to the marbled halls of the Capitol. They weren't just arresting people, they were harvesting them. Bitter Creek was a factory, and the raw material was human life. You can't keep everyone quiet, Clara whispered. We don't have to keep them quiet, Sterling replied, turning to leave. We just have to keep them busy. Hunger and exhaustion are better silencers than any gag. By the time anyone asks where you went, you'll be a name on a ledger that's already been closed. He signaled to Galt, who stood in the shadows of the hallway. Move her to the lower pens tonight. We have a shipment of ore leaving at dawn, and I want the sorting lines full. As Sterling walked away, Galt stepped forward, his face twisted in a sneer. But as he reached for the keys, he stopped. He looked toward the open jailhouse door. The sound of the town had changed. The constant, rhythmic hammering of the mines, the heartbeat of Bitter Creek, had suddenly faltered. One by one, the stamps were falling silent. "What is that?" Galt muttered, his hand dropping from the keys to his holster. "It's not a sound, Marshal," Clara said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "It's the absence of one." Outside, the midday sun was high, but a strange, heavy cold was rolling in from the flats. The town wasn't just quiet, it was breathless. The machine had stopped. The silence in Bitter Creek was more violent than a scream. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a landslide, a heavy, suffocating pressure that made the lungs ache. In the center of the street, the traffic had frozen. Freight wagons sat stalled, the teamsters held their reins with white-knuckled grips, their eyes fixed on the northern bend of the road where the sagebrush met the dust. One by one, the shopkeepers stepped out onto the boardwalks, wiping their hands on aprons, their faces etched with the same grim curiosity. Then, they heard it. It wasn't the thunder of a posse. It was a single, rhythmic clack-hiss of boots on dry earth and the slow, metallic jingle of a lone horse's bit. A man appeared. He didn't ride into town with the bravado of a gunslinger. He walked. He led a massive, deep-chested bay stallion by a lead rope. The man wore a duster coat so layered with the dust of the trail it looked like it was carved from the canyon walls. His hat was pulled low, casting a sharp triangular shadow over a face that looked less like flesh and more like weathered flint. He didn't look left or right. He walked toward the jailhouse with a gait that suggested he wasn't moving through the town, but through a memory. Marshal Galt scrambled onto the porch, his 4 deputies fanning out behind him. They gripped their Winchester rifles, but the wood felt slick in their hands. They had spent years bullying miners and travelers, but they were looking at something they couldn't categorize. "That's far enough," Galt shouted, his voice cracking like a dry twig. "State your business or turn that horse around." The man stopped. He didn't drop the lead rope. He stood exactly 30 paces from the porch, a distance any lawman knew was the edge of a man's life. He didn't speak immediately. He reached into his duster and pulled out a small, silver harmonica. He tapped it against his palm, then tucked it back into a pocket. The gesture was so calm, so utterly devoid of fear, that it chilled the blood of every man watching. "My name is Silas Thorne," the man said. The voice was low, vibrating with a resonance that seemed to come from the earth itself. "I've come for my kin." "The girl is state property now," Galt barked, emboldened by the rifles behind him. "The syndicate has the paperwork. It's signed, sealed, and backed by the governor. You're trespassing on a legal detention, Thorne." Silas Thorne finally looked up. His eyes were not angry. They were empty. It was the look of a man who had already decided the end of the story and was simply waiting for the clock to strike the hour. "I don't care about your paper," Thorne said. "I care about the girl. And I care about the brother you worked into a hole in the ground." "You're one man, Thorne," a deputy yelled, his rifle barrel swaying. "One man against a whole town." Thorne took a single step forward. The deputies flinched, 2 of them nearly leveling their rifles. "I'm not against the town," Thorne said softly. "I'm just against the men who think they can own a soul. Now, you have until the shadow of that clock tower touches the trough to bring her out. After that, I stop talking." He stood there, a pillar of brown canvas and iron, as the shadow of the Bitter Creek clock tower began its slow, inevitable crawl across the dirt. The shadow of the clock tower touched the edge of the water trough with the precision of a guillotine. In that final second of silence, Marshal Galt made a choice. It was the choice of a man who believed that numbers outweighed conviction. He didn't speak. He simply nodded to the deputy on his left. The deputy began to shoulder his Winchester. Silas Thorne did not draw like a man in a stage play. There was no theatrical flourish. His hand moved with a terrifying economy of motion. A blur of brown canvas and cold steel. The heavy Colt dragoon roared once. The deputy's rifle didn't just fall, it disintegrated. The shot struck the receiver, spraying sparks and splinters into the man's face. He collapsed, clutching his hands, not dead, but broken. Thorne didn't stay still. He moved forward, closing the distance while the air was still heavy with the smell of black powder. The other deputies fired, but they were shooting at a ghost that was already among them. Thorne used the bay stallion as a moving shield for a heartbeat, then stepped into the space between the lawmen. He didn't fire again. He used the pistol as a weight, a heavy iron extension of his arm. He struck the second deputy with a blow that cracked the man's jaw and sent him spinning into the dirt. He caught the third by the throat, the strength in his hand enough to lift the man off his heels, and flung him through the glass window of the marshal's own office. Galt pulled his revolver, but his thumb slipped on the hammer. By the time he looked up, the muzzle of Thorne's dragoon was resting against the bridge of his nose. "The key," Thorne said. The marshal's breath came in ragged, wet gasps. He looked at his men, one screaming, two unconscious, one buried in shards of glass. He looked at the townspeople, who stood frozen, watching their authority crumble into the dust in less than 30 seconds. Galt's hand shook so violently that the key ring jingled like a bell. He dropped it. Thorne didn't take his eyes off Galt as he reached down and scooped the keys from the dirt. "Clara!" Thorne called out. The basement door beneath the porch kicked open. Clara stumbled out, her eyes squinting against the brutal noon sun. She saw the carnage on the porch, and then she saw the man in the duster. "Uncle Silas," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Go to the horse," Thorne commanded. As Clara moved, Sterling, the man from the syndicate, stepped out onto his balcony across the street. He held a small derringer, his face pale with the fury of a man losing his investment. "You think this changes anything, Thorne? The law will hunt you across every state. You've stolen syndicate property." Thorne turned his head slowly. He didn't point his gun at Sterling. He reached into his duster and pulled out the heavy leather satchel he'd been carrying. He threw it. It landed at Sterling's feet on the balcony, bursting open to reveal a stack of payroll ledgers and a hoard of silver coins. "That's the labor debt for every person in this town," Thorne said, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet. "I took it from your transport wagon on the North Road. By your own laws, their time is paid for. If you try to collect again, I won't be auditing your books. I'll be closing them. Permanently." Sterling looked at the silver, then at the man in the street. He didn't fire. He couldn't. The power of the syndicate was built on the illusion of control, and Silas Thorne had just shattered the glass. The departure was as quiet as the arrival. Silas helped Clara onto the bay stallion, stepping up behind her with a practiced, heavy grace. He didn't look back at the broken men on the porch or the silver scattered on the balcony. He simply turned the horse and began the long walk out of Bitter Creek. As the dust settled, something strange happened. The miners, who had been watching from the shadows of the shafts, didn't return to the earth. They began to walk. Some headed for the stables, others simply started down the road on foot, their shovels and picks left where they fell. The machine of Bitter Creek hadn't just stopped, it had been abandoned. By sunset, the town felt like a tomb. Without the forced labor and the fear that greased the wheels, the syndicate's empire was nothing more than wood and stone. Mr. Sterling remained on his balcony, the silver coin still glinting in the dying light, but he was a king of ghosts. The law had been exposed as a lie, and in the West, once a lie is seen, it can never be told again. 5 miles out, on a ridge overlooking the valley, Silas pulled the reins. He and Clara sat in silence as the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. Below them, the lights of Bitter Creek flickered weakly, looking small and insignificant against the vastness of the desert. "Is it over, Uncle?" Clara asked softly. Silas looked out at the horizon. "It's never over, Clara. Men like Sterling will always build fences. Men like Galt will always take a wage to guard them. All we did today was move the fence back a little." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled letter from her brother. He handed it to her. "Thomas didn't die for a debt," Silas said, his voice lower than the wind. "He died because he believed a man's time belongs to him. We'll find a place to bury this where the sun hits the ground first. That's all the justice the dead get." They rode on into the night, disappearing into the jagged silhouettes of the mountains. They didn't go toward a town or a sanctuary. They went toward the open country, the only place where a name like Thorne could breathe. The story of Bitter Creek would be told in saloons and around campfires for decades. It wouldn't be told as a story of a rescue, but as a parable of inevitability. It became a warning to those who would use the law to cage the innocent, that there is a ledger beyond the reach of men, and eventually, a hand will come to balance the scales. The desert eventually reclaimed the town. The mines filled with water, and the boardwalks rotted into the sand. But even years later, travelers said that when the wind blew from the north, you could still hear the faint, ghostly sound of a harmonica, a cold, thin melody reminding the land that while silver may rule the day, the night belongs to the reckoning. Silas Thorne was never seen again. But in the West, you don't need to see the storm to know it's coming. You only need to feel the change in the air.